Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic, the words test optional and test blind have been floating around by colleges. Every so often we hear that one college announced it's test optional for future admissions and another just announced it's test blind. But what do these mean? And how does it affect your college applications and test taking? Does test optional and test blind still mean that you need to take the SAT in order to increase your chances to get in? Before we get into that though, hit that subscribe button if you want an SAT score that starts with a 16 and ends in 2 zeros on your next administration. But without further ado, let's get into test optional versus test blind. First, let's go over the more commonly heard term test optional. Test optional is when it's not mandatory for students to submit their SAT or ACT scores for their college applications, and they can successfully apply without them. Now, as simple as that sounds, the implication of going test optional is that some students are going to submit their scores, whereas others are not going to. A big factor on which students submit their scores is if they did well on the test. Those who get a 1600 in the SAT or a 36 in the ACT are probably not going to go test optional because they have awesome scores. So those who get like a 1000 on the SAT or like an 18 on the ACT are more likely not to submit it, meaning test optional will give a benefit to those who are submitting their scores and have high scores. So it won't necessarily harm you if you have low scores, but there will be others ahead of you potentially. Now in test blind, when a school announces that they are going test blind, they're not just giving flexibility if you're unable to submit your SAT or ACT score, but they're actually going to completely disregard them. So, for example, if you get that 1636 in the SAT and ACT, let's say you're applying to a famous test blind school like Caltech, they're not going to even look at those scores. They won't glance at them twice. In other words, there's no point in submitting those scores at all because they're not going to look at them. Many schools are actually switching to test blind with the COVID-19 pandemic to accommodate those students who weren't able to access tests due to shutdowns, and also helps low-income students who may not potentially have the affordability to take those tests. Now, to simplify this difference, let's use an analogy. Test optional is kind of like offering an extra credit assignment. If you take it, it's going to boost your grade, but for those who don't take it, there might be others in your class who get ahead of you because they take the extra credit. However, test blind is kind of like eliminating an assignment entirely out of the gradebook. It's going to basically affect everybody. Nobody will be able to submit it, whether you're going to get a perfect score or a 10%. Nobody is helped, nobody's harmed, and it has zero effect. Now let's address the elephant in the room, that major question. Should you still study hard and take the SAT or ACT with all of these schools going test optional, test blind? Do you need it? Now to answer that question, it depends on what schools you want to apply to and their specific policy. If you're applying to a bunch of test optional schools, which would take into account your standardized test scores, should you submit them, then yes, I would recommend taking them to give that boost. Study during the summer or whenever you have time and aim for that high score so you can take advantage of that extra credit. This is especially true if your GPA is below that school's 50th percentile, meaning your SAT score will compensate for that and potentially make you shine academically. In other words, if you're applying to Harvard, for example, which is a test optional school, and you have a 3.7 GPA, which is below average, and no standardized tests, you might not look as attractive as somebody with a 3.7 and a 1600 in their SAT. Now, if the schools you're applying to are test blind, then your answer is the opposite. Don't take the SAT or ACT because they're not going to look at it. Most students, however, apply to a mix of both test optional and test blind schools. That's just how people plan out their colleges. So you should plan on taking the SAT or ACT if you're financially able to. And if you're not financially able, you should explain that on your common application, the extra section, telling them why you couldn't take the SAT or ACT. Anyways, I hope you were able to learn the difference between test optional and test blind in this video because they're definitely very different and have very different implications in terms of your test taking and your college applications. Many high schools offer a free SAT administration in April. So if that's coming up for you, maybe consider studying and taking that and knocking that score out of the park so you have it ready to give to your schools. Now, subscribe, turn on notifications to be the first to receive new content, and like the video. Until next time, see you later.